Hey, really quickly, how many of you were here over the weekend? By a show of hands. Wow, quite a few. If you weren't, there were 1,300 high school students learning about how God is their creator and what that means for how they live their lives. Your church, I do a lot of these events, was one of the most hospitable and well-planned churches I have worked with. So you should give it up for them. They did a great job. In the first service, talked about there is such a thing as truth, how we know subjective claims are different from objective claims, and why truth is so important. Jesus didn't just claim to be a truth, he claimed to be the truth. And the question, kind of the nail biter I left you with is, then how do we know Christianity is true? One way to approach this is to look at how do we know the Bible, in particular, the New Testament and the Gospels, are actually true and reliable. A number of years ago, a new version of the iPhone came out, and I had to get one, so I got in line at a mall near where I live in southern Orange County and waited 4 hours for my phone. The line went out of the store and down about 4 stores, and I'm standing there waiting. And these 3 high school students came up to the guy right next to me. They said, word for word, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think? Doesn't say a single thing, turns around, leans on the railing, and turns his back to these kids. They're a little embarrassed. They start to walk away. I stopped them. I said, hey, what are you guys doing? They said, well, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think? I said, I'm not even sure he existed. Do you really believe that Christian stuff? They said, of course we do. Jesus is the Son of God, and he died on the cross for your sins, and they start preaching the gospel. And I said, why should I believe that story? They said, well, it's right here in the Bible, which is the holy word of God. And I said, why should I trust that book? And they said, well, if you turn to 2 Timothy, it tells us all scripture is inspired. I said, wait a minute. If we want to know if we can trust that book, you can't turn to a passage within that book, assuming it's true to prove itself. That's called circular reasoning. He said, good point. I said, is there any evidence outside of that book that confirms the claims within? He said, yes. Don't you know there's these tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts that perfectly line up and tell us we have the Bible exactly as it was first written down? I said, really? Do you know how many words are in the original Greek New Testament? And at this point, I know exactly what he was thinking. Why did I have to talk to this guy? He said, I have no idea. I said, there's about 135 to 136,000 words. Now, if you take the different manuscripts you're talking about and you compare them, there's between 300,000 and 400,000 differences. That means for every word in the Bible, there could be 2 or 3 other words. Can you explain that to me? He goes, what do you think about evolution? I said, I'm glad you asked. The evidence is overwhelming. We have vestigial structures on our back left over from our ancestors with tails. Having seen human and chimp DNA lines up 99.72%. What about biogeographical distribution of fossils? I'm going on and on. And this guy's backing up and his eyes are getting bigger and bigger until I stopped and I said, hey, look, I got a confession to make. I'm a Christian. And I wish you could have seen his response. He goes, oh. But a girl next to him looked bothered by this. She said, was all that stuff true? I said, look, no, it wasn't true. I said, like you, I'm a Christian. I think the Bible's true. I said, good for you guys. On a Saturday in July in Southern California, when you're 10 minutes from the beach, being out talking with people about Jesus. But if you're going to tell people they should bank their lives on an ancient book, don't you think you should at least have some good reasons that this book is true? Well, they left. Maybe 15 minutes later, I feel a tap on my shoulder. I turn around. It's 3 new students who say, hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think? I'm like, okay, here we go again, until I stop and I look over their shoulders. About as far back as the back of this room, I see the original students who set up their friends to convert the atheists. Now, I do love sharing that story because I think all of us intuitively know, yeah, 1 Peter 3:15 is right. When it says, sanctify Christ as Lord, always be ready with an answer for the hope within, give it with gentleness, and give it with respect. Given that the root of our faith is expressed in the scriptures, how do we know the scriptures are true? Well, I teach in a graduate course on apologetics, so this talk is like summed up an entire course in a practical, hopefully easy way to memorize or remember to just share with somebody who asks you. And we're going to look at just 3 tests that I call the character test, the copy test, and the corroboration test, one by one. Now, before we jump in, a handful of you asked me, they're like, McDowell, are you related to Josh McDowell? Josh McDowell is my father. He's written over 150 books, and he's actually spoken live to more young people than anybody in world history as far as they can tell. He's 84, he's alive, lived a modern day Apostle Paul kind of, well, thank you. Amazing life. My dad had severe abuse where he was growing up on the farm, a sister who took her own life, a father who's an alcoholic, set out to prove Christianity's false because some Christians challenged him, was rocked by the evidence, drawn by the love of God, and in 1972 wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. We updated it recently, and when it came out, my dad used a phrase, he said, there's a tsunami of evidence for Christianity. So I wrote an article on his behalf, that's the book that he wrote in the update, for Fox News, and he approved it to say it expressed his heart, called Their Evidence for Christianity is Like a Tsunami. It launched that book into number 16 on all books on Amazon for that week. Now, that is wow, why? Because we're often told people aren't interested in truth today. Friends, there's a lot of people, if we are ready with an answer, who are open to hearing about Christianity and why it's true. That's why it's more important than ever that we follow what 1 Peter 3:15 says. So let's jump in and look at what we call the character test. And that's basically asking the question, was an ancient document put together with honesty? In other words, do we have reason to believe we can trust the character and intentions of the writer? Well, if you ever just read the New Testament and the Gospels, it's amazing how many times they go out of their way to tell us that they at least care about truth. So Luke, who was a what, by the way? A doctor. He's a physician, educated, starts his gospel by saying this: many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were. So Luke's not an eyewitness, but he's investigating eyewitnesses and servants to the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write in order to count so you may the certainty of the things that you've been taught. This is an ancient way of saying, I've done my due diligence, and what I'm presenting to you, I believe is true. But Luke wasn't an eyewitness. Peter was. In 2 Peter 1:16, Peter says, we did not follow cleverly invented stories that were just passed on to us from someone else. When we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were what? Eyewitnesses of his majesty. What about John? So John writes the Gospel of John, but also the epistles. Have you ever noticed how John begins his epistle? Look at how many senses he appeals to. He says, what was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've looked at, what we've touched with our hands. He appeals to 3 senses. This isn't a story we heard over a campfire from somebody that was passed down. We saw it, we heard it, we touched. That's what we proclaim to you. This is just a sampling of what the New Testament writers tell us about how much they care about reporting truth. But let's take it a step further. Does this document have the ring of truth? So when a story is invented, how does it often begin? Yeah, once upon a time or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Notice how this is a distant time and a distant land somewhere, once upon a time. That's often how fairy tales take place. So you can't check them out because they're fiction. This is not what the New Testament writers do. In fact, notice how many details Luke gives us that historians can actually check out and confirm. He says, now in the 15th year, not the 14th year, not the 20th year, the exact year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, not Julius Caesar, not Augustus Caesar, When Pontius Pilate gives us the name, was governor, his position, and the region of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the reign of Iturea. This is not in a land far, far away. Luke gives us way more details than we even need because he wants us to know exactly when and where and who's involved when this person, Jesus, came on the scene. And we can check out Luke, and he's a remarkably accurate historian. He got it right. Now we can take it a step even further. So the writers claim we investigated this. We were eyewitnesses. They don't place it in a distant land. They place it who, when, and where. But the New Testament also includes what we call embarrassing material. Now, why is this important? Human nature is when we make up information, it's either to get out of trouble or to make ourselves look good. Isn't that human nature? Years ago, my sister left her computer open, and she happened to leave it open to a certain popular social media app of the time. So I just felt the need to let the world know on her behalf how incredibly wonderful her older brother is. Now, I didn't get on there and say, my brother's a loser, I hate him. There was no temptation. And it was fun, and she knew instantly it was me. People were like, that's so wonderful, I'm in tears. I was like, yes. But human nature is just to make up stuff to make ourselves look good. Just look at social media. That's what everybody's doing, right? So when historians notice that a writer includes material that's disparaging to their character, they see that as a sign that the writer cares more about truth than his or her own reputation, especially in an honor-shame society. So if you just read the New Testament, it's full of embarrassing material about the Gospels, the Gospel writers, the apostles. So Peter denies Jesus 3 times. In fact, Jesus calls Peter Satan. Now, don't miss the force of this. Sometimes friends will try to win like the insult battle with each other, right? It's a kind of sign of affection. Like my son, to be honest, when my son was, I think, 11 and 12, he loved these your mama jokes. I'm like, buddy, I'm not a huge fan. He goes, Dad, I got one for you. I'm like, okay. He goes, your mama's so poor, ducks throw bread at her. I'm like, buddy, that's your grandma, by the way. But sometimes we think it's funny to try to take a shot at each other. And then, of course, it crosses a line, right? That's not what's happening with Peter and Jesus. It's not like Peter's like, oh man, you got me. You called me Satan. Good one, Jesus. It was the opposite. This is the insult of insults. As embarrassing and shameful as it could be. Why invent that? Why invent that? How about the disciples fall asleep in Gethsemane 3 times? Jesus is like, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, sleep, sleep, sleep. In fact, sometimes the disciples don't even understand the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, we don't get it. And finally, who discovers the empty tomb? Women do in all 4 Gospels. In that culture, someone's excited. In that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's. It was a patriarchal culture, and men tended to be educated more. So if you're inventing a story to try to convince people that somebody died and was buried, had an empty tomb, and resurrected, who is the least likely witnesses you would invent in that culture? The women. So why do they report it? Because that's what they are convinced is actually true. So the gospel writers report embarrassing material because they have the character to report the truth. And I think we can take it one step further. The question is, what did it cost the apostles to believe in and proclaim Jesus? According to church history, Peter was crucified, Andrew was crucified, Philip was crucified, Bartholomew flayed to death, James the Great beheaded, Matthew killed with a sword, Matthias stoned to death, and this has nothing to do with smoking pot, just for the record. I have to clarify that. I'm from California. Thomas stabbed with spears, John died after exile, Luke hanged, James addressed thrown and beaten, Mark dragged death by horse, and Paul beheaded. Now, I actually did my PhD dissertation on the question of how much of this is history and how much of this is legend. And I think sometimes it's hard to know. But we know for sure with confidence that minimally these 4 died as martyrs for their belief that Jesus had risen from the grave. The rest of the apostles, just read the beginning of Acts. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison and said, don't preach Jesus. And they intentionally put themselves in harm's way and say, we fear God more than we fear men. Jesus is the risen Lord. Why invent a story like this that intentionally pits yourself against the very Roman Empire that crucified your leader as an enemy of the state? It makes no sense unless they really think it's true and really believe that Jesus had appeared to them. Last way to put this, I have a friend of mine. He's a co-author of mine too. His name is J. Warner Wallace. Some of you might recognize his name. He probably was here last year speaking at the conference. He's a cold case detective, never lost a case in a court of law. Maybe you've seen him on Dateline or Nightline on those shows. He was an atheist till he was 35. Went to Rick Warren's church, heard the gospel, and said, I'm going to analyze the Gospel of Mark through the lens of forensic science. I've actually seen this Bible. He went line by line and analyzed and concluded this is reliable testimony. One thing he's told me, he said, Sean, in every court case that I'm a part of, people commit crimes for one of three reasons: power, sex, and money. Were the apostles motivated by power? No, they followed someone who gave his life and said, follow me, pick up your cross. Were they motivated by money? Of course not. One of the emphases of the early church was to give to the poor. Were they motivated by sex? Look, Jesus had opportunity to take advantage of women, but he showed nothing but dignity and honor and respect for women, unlike the vast majority of other major religious figures. The apostles were not liars. They reported what they thought was true. They didn't place the story in a distant land. They told us who, when, where, and exactly so we could track it down and look at it. They include embarrassing material and are willing to suffer and die for it. I'm not sure what else they could do to at least convince us that they cared about truth. The second question is what we call the copy test. You say, okay, they care about truth, but how do we know this book written 2,000 years ago hasn't been changed over time? Like the telephone game, right? I was on a plane years ago. I landed in Orange County, and I looked about 10 rows in front and saw one of my good friends. I was like, oh my goodness, we're on the same flight. I'll text him so he stays afterwards and we can chat. So I texted him word for word, hey punk, I'm right behind you. And I sent it to my mom, who is home alone at night reading. To this day, I wish I had screenshotted it because she wrote me back. She said, hey son, I think you got the wrong punk. I was like, dang it. It's amazing, even in our era of mass communication, sometimes communication fails and we have fake news. Well, how do we know a book written 2,000 years ago hasn't been miscommunicated or changed? That's an important question. Now, this is a question that textual critics ask and study of all books of antiquity. And one way of approaching this is to consider the time gap between when a document was written and the copy we have. The more time, in principle, the more chance for intentional or unintentional error. So we want to have shorter time in general, because the original would be written down on a scroll or an ancient codice, and then it would disintegrate. So the question is, do we have generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, etc.? Well, for many ancient books, like Pliny the Elder, a Roman, 700 years, Josephus, a Jewish writer, 800 years, and Herodotus, a Greek writer, 1,500 years. These are not uncommon distances from when a manuscript is written and between a copy we have. By the way, a manuscript was a handwritten copy, either of a whole manuscript or a portion of it before the printing press. So you look at a lot of ancient books and you can see the time gap. What do we have for at least the first portion of the New Testament? Probably within 10 to 100 years. That's a significantly less time gap. We have what's called the John Rylands Papyri. This is believed to be the oldest physical portion of the manuscript we have, from either about 100 to 200 AD. It's about the size of a credit card and has writing on the front and the back. This is why Daniel Wallace, a textual critic expert, a Greek expert, kind of a modern-day Indiana Jones, he says this. He says, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Now, I don't know a lot of Julius Caesar skeptics. I don't know a lot of Alexander the Great doubters. Yet I know a lot of skeptics and a lot of doubters about Jesus. Why? Well, in one sense, Jesus did some reportedly miraculous and dramatic things, so we should have some good evidence if we're going to make those claims. But Jesus also made claims that Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great did not make. No offense to any historians, but when it's all said and done, it makes no difference for your life and your eternal destiny what you believe about Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. But Jesus said the most important question you can answer is when he asked, who do you say that I am? So in terms of time gaps, we tend to have much earlier portions or copies in the New Testament than most ancient books. Well, the second question is, how many manuscripts do we have? Ideally, you want more so you can compare them and contrast them, but the more you have, the more differences you might find. So for many ancient books like Caesar, we have 10 manuscripts. Plato's tetralogies, we have 7. Well, when we updated the new evidence that demands a verdict, we hired a researcher to do his best to track down what is the most accurate current number we have of New Testament manuscripts. What did he conclude? Over 24,000 manuscripts. That's pretty remarkable. So if you put it on a chart and compare the New Testament with other ancient books, you can see it's like comparing apples and oranges. Now, here's a visual way Dan Wallace says. He says, if you take the average classical writer and you compiled all the physical copies they have, it would be about 4 feet high, about this tall. If you took the New Testament, how high would it be? As high as Denver, over a mile high. Again, apples and oranges. So how earlier the copies are, and the number of copies is far beyond any book of the ancient world. Now, if you take just Greek manuscripts, because the 24,000 includes Coptic and Latin, etc., there's about 5,300 plus Greek manuscripts. Now, you'll remember when I told that story at the beginning, in line with those students who want to talk about Jesus, I said, what about all the differences across these manuscripts? Bart Ehrman from UNC, probably one of the most influential skeptics and agnostics/atheists alive today, he said there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. In other words, when you compare the different manuscripts, the thousands we have, we find more differences than the words alone in the New Testament. Now, he's right about that, but if you just let it sit, that feels very unsettling. But the devil is in the details. So James Prothero, in their book Myths and Mistakes, said most of these are inconsequential changes in orthography or word order. There are so many errors to speak of across the textual tradition that has so many handmade copies. The reasons there's so many differences is because we have so many copies. In fact, in many ways, we should expect a lot more than we actually have. So a friend of mine, Peter Gurry, says he estimates there's roughly 500,000 non-spelling variants across Greek manuscripts. That's his best estimate. Now, what does that mean? Let me give you just a sample of the kind of differences that we find, because besides what you might think, the Bible did not float down from heaven in the King James Version and just hand in our lap. That's not what happened. It was written down and copied and translated, but with the utmost care. So here's the kind of difference that we see. If you've read the Gospel of Mark, you will know The theme of the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the point. So when Jesus, you see the book come to climax in Mark 15:29, when even the centurion says, surely this was the Son of God. And it's repeated through the whole book. Well, we have some different copies of Mark. And some in the first line says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Some don't have that reference. That's an example of a difference and a variant across manuscripts. Now, as far as I'm aware, we don't know if that was in the original or if it was added later for clarification. We don't know. That's a difference, but has nothing to do with the meaning or purpose of Mark. It's irrelevant to whether Mark is true or not. We don't know if it was in there or if a later scribe just added it for clarification. But can you see the kind of differences that scholars will come across? Now, can anybody give me an example of a verse in the New Testament, one verse alone that proves the Trinity? It's a little tricky to do. Now, there is one in 1 John 5:7. It says, there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. The problem is that appears much later than our earlier copies and was probably inserted later. That's why if you look in your Bibles, it'll say 1 John 6 and then go to 1 John 8. Now, this is no conspiracy. There's no secret. But most scholars would say this verse was probably added later for some reason we don't know. Now, what's at stake with this? Is the Trinity at stake with this? No. It's actually hard to do than you think. Try to go like this and say yes. It'll mess with you. You got to work on it and practice it. The Trinity is not at stake because it's caught clearly in the scriptures. It's taught there. What is at stake is whether this verse itself was in 1 John or not. But no doctrine of the Christian faith is in doubt. The only disputed New Testament passages more than 2 verses in length are the ending of Mark and John 7:53 through 8:11. Those are the only passages of any length for which there's debate. So the ending of Mark, it's the Great Commission that also includes the only place in the Bible about snake handling. Most scholars would say that was not in the original and added later. Most scholars would agree on that, and I think they're probably right. And again, there's no conspiracy. If you look in your Bible, sometimes it's put in brackets and a footnote is there. Nobody's trying to keep this away from you. What's the story in John 7:53 through 8:11, by the way? Anybody know? It's the woman in the well is John 4. John 7:53 is the woman caught in adultery. Now, let's be honest. This is a beautiful story. I kind of want it to be true, but it doesn't appear in our earliest manuscripts. It's also not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So we don't really know if it was in the original or not. Probably most scholars would say it wasn't. And by the way, this is no big conspiracy. There's probably a footnote if you have a Bible here. Now, what follows from the fact that we're not certain about the ending of Mark, and we're not certain about 1 John 5:7, and we're not certain about this story in John? Does it follow that the Gospels are unreliable? And the answer is absolutely no. What follows is we're not sure about the end of Mark, we're not sure about the story in John, and 1 John 5:7 probably was not in the original. That casts no doubt on the rest of the reliability of the scriptures that we have confidence in, even though there's a handful of passages for which textual critics are debating. Right now, what's interesting is you might tend to think the further we get away from the events of Jesus, the less confidence we have. It's actually the opposite. The further we get away, the more archaeology advances, the more we have things like drones and the more we have things like artificial intelligence to actually help us better discover and understand those events. So the correct translation and original words is out there. We're just trying to get closer and closer and closer to figuring out what it is. So my point is, it's important to not say we have every single letter and word exactly as it was written down, because then people will come across challenges like I showed you, and they'll start to question everything. But what certainly doesn't follow is that we don't have a high degree of confidence that our scriptures were written down carefully and have been preserved over time. This is why Craig Blomberg, a wonderful New Testament scholar, says, no orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. There are always undisputed passages one can consult that teach the same truths. And I think he's right. And this is why Giorgio Pasquale, a classicist, says no other Greek text is handled so richly and credibly as the New Testament. It's amazing to me how many other ancient books with less manuscripts written later people trust. And yet when it comes to the New Testament, with more manuscripts earlier, we see a double standard and people don't trust it. We have every reason to believe that the Gospels and the New Testament have been handled with the utmost care. So we've looked at two tests so far. The character test. The apostles say we investigated. They say we were eyewitnesses. We saw, we touched, we heard. They don't place it in a distant land. They tell us who and when and where. They include embarrassing material, and they're willing to suffer and die for the belief they've seen the risen Jesus. They had the character, by all accounts, to care about and report truth. What about the copy test? Well, we have more copies and earlier copies than any other ancient book. We have every reason to believe the New Testament has been handled with the utmost care. The third test, our final C, is what we call the corroboration test. Is there evidence outside of this book that supports the claims within? This is where other ancient writers and archaeology comes into play. Now, to be really honest with you, if you compare the New Testament with, say, the Book of Mormon, it's like apples and oranges. There is no convincing archaeological corroborative support for the claims in the Book of Mormon. You're not going to drive not far from here from the Smithsonian and even remotely consider using the Book of Mormon as a guide to understanding, even though they claim that certain things happen here in America. When it comes to the New Testament, if you take the claims that are made and you actually go to Israel and the lands in which it reports, you can find and see the very places that are talked about in most cases. So this is what we call the corroboration test. Do other historical materials confirm or deny the testimony provided by the documents itself? Well, there's entire books written on this. In fact, there's an archaeological study Bible that, like page after page, talks about archaeological discoveries that help corroborate the New Testament. Now, before we go in, we haven't found everything. In fact, probably most things we haven't found. Some things are destroyed. There's politics involved in Israel, places you can dig, places you can't dig. But consistently, we're coming across archaeological discoveries that are illuminating and corroborating the claims in the New Testament. So here's just a handful of my favorite ones. For years, Pilate was described only in literary sources, either the New Testament and writers like Josephus. Until in the 1960s, they came across this slab that describes, and by the way, it was in Caesarea Maritima, in the time and place you should expect to find it, referencing Pontius Pilate under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. He was a historical person in the time and place the Gospels describe. Another example, this is a picture from 2019 in a town called Bethesda. Now, Bethesda is in the Jerusalem area, and there's described in the Gospel of John kind of 5 porticos or 5 colonnade structures. Well, for years, skeptics were skeptical of this claim because the archaeology didn't seem to match it until they dug down and discovered kind of this waterway that's described, this pool that's described in John 5. And guess what they found? 5 porticos. Actually, I had a student do a presentation of this, and they said they dug in Bethesda and they found 5 porpoises. I was like, what translation are you using? They didn't find dolphins, but that's what I get for teaching freshmen. They tell you there's no such thing as a stupid question. That's a lie, just for the record. They found 5 porticos or colonnades as described in John. Another example, this is one of my favorite. This Harvard professor years ago said there is astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. Now, why is that important? Most of the victims that they found, or all at one point, have been crucified with ropes. And yet Thomas says, I want to see the nail marks in your hand and in your feet. Did the gospel writer of John get it wrong? Well, for years, people thought that was the case until they came across this archaeological discovery in 1967 of a man they've named Yehohanan, who was crucified in the Palestinian Judea area in the middle of the 1st century. And what's interesting is the nail was stuck in there because it's kind of lodged in a knot. They couldn't pull it out. It's possible they can't prove that his legs might have been broken the way they would describe crucifixion, breaking legs, so somebody would die by asphyxiation, as described happened to the thieves next to Jesus. Since then, they found many examples. Even about 2 or 3 years ago, they found another victim who was crucified with nails in Britain, but that was a part of the Roman Empire in the 1st century. I love it when archaeology and science catches up with the Bible. My father and I put it this way. We say archaeology provides one important piece of evidence that helps confirm the New Testament record. So much more could be said. I left a lot out, and there's probably a lot of objections you're thinking of that I admittedly have not addressed. I'm not pretending to. But I think if we just look at the New Testament like we do other ancient books, we have reason to believe that the writers care about truth. We have reason to believe that it's been copied with care over time. And then we find corroboration in ancient writers and in the archaeological record that matches it up. Now, I know some of you are thinking of, what about Sean, the Spider-Man objection? I know that's on your mind, especially since it's on the back of my computer. Now, what do I mean by the Spider-Man objection? Spider-Man is a fictional story that is rooted in New York City. Sometimes there's real political figures tied in. Sometimes there's real buildings and places. So the mere fact that you have archaeology tells us nothing about Spider-Man actually existing. That's a fair objection. But keep something in mind. We know the genre of where Spider-Man first appeared, and it's called a comic book. We all know that it's fiction. The genre of the Gospels is not fiction. They're ancient biographies about real historical figures. So if they tell us, we've investigated, we were there, we saw, and then we can go and confirm the things that they report, it's a way of confirming the larger narrative that separates it from a fictional superhero in a comic book. Friends, thank you, brother. We have every reason to believe that the New Testament is reliable. Now, I haven't talked about the Old Testament. That's a whole separate issue, but just to give you one taste, just a couple weeks, maybe a couple months ago, interviewed a friend of mine who's an archaeologist in Jordan. And he was able, through a long time of diplomacy, to get into Iraq, which is where ancient Babylon was. Now, why did he want to go there? Because a prophecy was made in Isaiah and Jeremiah hundreds of years before the time of Christ, that Babylon, one of the most powerful cities of its day, would be destroyed and never rebuilt. And jackals and owls would live there. Take a wild guess what Babylon is like today. He actually goes there with his camera. Saddam's palace was built outside the walls of the old city. It's never been rebuilt. He said, Sean, to the locals, it feels like there's a curse on this land. He walked around and literally filmed jackals and owls living there. That's just one example of the kind of evidence we have to show that Christianity is true. 1 Peter says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer. For the hope within, give it with gentleness and give it with respect. I'm convinced when you and I are ready with an answer, for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, God can use us in their lives to remove barriers, to help them see, like he did with my father 6 decades ago, that Christianity is true and God has revealed himself through the scriptures. Amen? If some of you want to go a little further, we did write that 800-page book, but we just came out, my second most recent book is called Evidence for Jesus. We took that 700-page book and summed it up in like the Cliff Notes. You're welcome, by the way. And there's 25 chapters on the biggest questions about Jesus. How can you say Jesus is the only way? What's the evidence Jesus rose from the grave? How do we know the Bible is true? Are there contradictions in the Bible? Short chapters you can read in 5 minutes. I'm telling you, with Easter coming up, all of you just might have the chance to have conversations like this. So that book is back there called Evidence for Jesus. And then another book I wrote, it's a book called A Rebel's Manifesto. This book, I got the 25 toughest ethical questions people are asking on topics like transgender, immigration, gun control, racial tension. What biblical principles apply to this? And how do we engage people around us in gracious conversation who see the world differently? Our culture wants to cancel us. It's actually the rebel who leans in and says, I'm not going to compromise biblical truth, but I want to build relationship with you, and I want to be able to speak truth into your life lovingly. That's actually what it means to be a rebel today. So if that's helpful, I'm going to sneak out there. Would love to say hi, meet you, answer a question. It's been an absolute treat. Again, your church knocked it out of the park hosting the event this weekend. God bless you and keep it up. We'll see you out there.